It is looking good. So folks, we're going to be starting a little shortly. We're going to try to stay as close as we can to that 7 o'clock. And we will try to end close to, and close it right around 8. We did hear some feedback that people didn't have enough time to fill the evaluation. So we're going to send the evaluation out to those folks who have emails, but also give people a chance to fill the short 4 or 5 question evaluation before we end. So we'll end, at some point where we can bring that into it. So I think we'll get started. So I got on my official time. It's about 7:01. My name is Ajamal Binder. I'm the chair of the board of MORE, Movement Omaha for Race Equity. It's a group that started roughly around 10 years ago. Used to be Policy Research and Innovation. We had another name at some point. And part of our role is to deal with some of those issues that affect working class and low income and people of color. And in the past year or so, we changed our name to MORE, and we focus much more on race equity and anti-racism work. In Omaha, Nebraska, as many are aware, that we live in a very segregated community. It's been that way for years. And one of the things that we found out as we started to recalibrate our organization was there was not really any organization that had anti-racism in their mission statement. And we are basically a volunteer organization of board members. We don't have a paid executive director. But what's wonderful about what we've discovered over the past 2 years is how many people in this community want to engage on racial conversations and issues to help bring the world together, and also to talk about reconciliation, some of the contentious issues that people don't always know how to frame. So MORE is basically front and center on some of those agendas. And this event is going to be recorded and put on our webpage as well as it is on our webpage, as well as Facebook page also dealing with this issue. We have a 15-minute board of directors, 15 members for board of directors, and very much multiracial. And the majority of our board members are people of color. So before I get in heavy to this, I just want to do a little bit of introduction of the ground rules. This has been a pretty flexible presentation that we've had over the past few months and so on, is where we basically say to the audience or participants is that we have a number of questions we provide to our presenter to kind of frame or talk about the content area. I may engage in a little bit of conversation if need be. My role is going to be purely as a moderator tonight, and we will open it up about 30 minutes into the program to let the audience to participate either via Zoom, chat, Facebook chat, or even, as we say, call an audible, let you talk directly to the presenter and engage her on the topic that she's talking about. The other thing is we like for you to keep it brief. We hope to not have any long-winded diatribe because, again, we only have 1 hour, and I got to be adhere to that because I've been known to talk longer than I should, so I have a little timer to keep me on focus. But I'm going to stop there and just say I really appreciate you coming out and participating with us tonight. I got to learn how to talk a little slower sometime, Jamal. People tell me that. But I think this is an opportunity where we can really have what we call that candid, honest conversation on the topic of the day. My guest presenter today is Palma Joyce Strand, who is a professor of law at negotiation and conflict resolution program at Creighton University. She's also served as a steering committee on the Omaha Community for Racial Justice and Reconciliation. This is a group that's been talking about the Will Brown situation in 1919 and been involved in some racial and social justice issues in the community. Professor Strand is a co-founder and research director of national nonprofit Civic, I'm not saying if it's right, organization. She also designs and facilitates conversations on race and belonging and working with public educators in Nebraska and elsewhere. I know Palma for many years in terms of her work in the community. We've attended a number of workshops together. I've had the chance to speak in her class, and she's also had an opportunity to participate in some of our community events that we held at First United Methodist Church, where we dealt with a lot of the deep dives in these racial issues. But what she's really known for is facilitating and writing about issues that deal with law, redlining, and she kind of put redlining on the map again for us in Nebraska, particularly in Omaha. And she has an article in one of the Creighton academic publications that is excellent. So we've gotten to know each other over some of those exchanges. And I invited her on to talk about redlining, how that affects us today. As you've seen from the registration, we had a series of questions that I threw out at her. She's going to use that as her foundation for her presentation. And then we're going to open it up probably 30 minutes into the final part of the program and go from there. And without much further ado, Palma, if you could start and share a little bit more about yourself and then lead right into it. And I'm going to kind of back out a little bit. But thank you for being here today. And we look forward to this this invigorating, can you say it, powerful discussion where we can exchange ideas about the importance of redlining, and particularly in Omaha. So kind of excited to have you here. So let's go forward and make it happen. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, Ajmal. It's an honor to be invited to this conversation. And it's, we've had some great conversations about race and racism in Omaha and in general over the years. So this, I view this as sort of a continuation of those conversations, and I'm honored to be part of this this MORE series. And I really believe in and want to support in any way I can MORE's mission of having honest and open discussions of racism in the Omaha community. It's so important for all of us. And I should say, I think Ajmal did a great job of introducing who I am kind of professionally, and I'm going to say a few words about sort of how I came to this work. But I should say that I'm here tonight on my own behalf, although I am a faculty member at Creighton. I do not speak for the university. But I am going to start by kind of responding to the three questions that were kind of thrown at me by Ajmal that were on the advertisement for the session tonight. And after that presentation, then I'll be interested to see what questions arise, and I'll do my best to respond, and we'll see where the conversation goes. So the first question is, why and how does a white academic work on racism and work for anti-racism? And so, well, as with most people, my work grows out of my own story. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. In the East Bay, across the San Francisco Bay from the city itself, in a bedroom community suburb called El Cerrito. And my neighborhood and the neighborhood school that I attended for elementary school were both essentially all white. So that was kind of my formation, my place. But my grandparents, my mother's parents, who lived in the house at that point where my mother had grown up, lived in a neighborhood in South Berkeley, which is just bordering Oakland, for those of you who are familiar with the Bay Area. And that neighborhood had been racially and ethnically integrated when my mother was growing up, which was actually pre-redlining, which was kind of in the 20s and early 30s. But by the time that I came around, my grandparents were the only white household on the block. Everybody else was African American. And so when we went to visit, there was this whole different neighborhood with basically all Black people, except for my grandparents, compared to the neighborhood that I grew up in, which was essentially all white. So at an early age, I saw segregation. Although nobody ever really explained anything about it to me, like why these neighborhoods were different. That was just neighborhoods the way they were. So when I went from elementary school to junior high school, the school in my school district desegregated. That tells you something about my age. And I began going to school with kids from farther up the hill, and then also from farther down the hill, which is sort of the demarcation of socioeconomics in the Bay Area. And kids from Richmond, which for those of you, again, who are familiar with the Bay Area, is sort of an industrial working class neighborhood. And these kids that I was going to school with now were white, and they were Black, and they were kids of Japanese and Chinese and Mexican ancestry, and more. And I made friends, and I got a glimpse of a much less sort of sheltered world racially than the world of my neighborhood. And I learned a lot. I learned the term Chicana and the term Gringa and so many other things that, my peers were cluing me into. And lots more. So fast forward about 10 years, and in college, I met the man who is now my husband. And he's Black, he's African American. He grew up in segregated projects and went to segregated schools in the South. And we now have 3 biracial children who are kind of now in their 30s. And over the years, I came to see the advantages that my hardworking family had had in terms of getting ahead. And I realized that in a very specific, very personal way, that those advantages had not been available to my equally hardworking in-laws. And I also sort of came to realize, partly because of the family that I was in at that point, that the kind of the first absolutely essential step to dismantling this really deep-seated system of racism was to name it, and for people to be open and honest in talking about it. And that's what I kind of started to learn and try to do, was to really identify it where I saw it, and to describe it and take action. And so when I came to Creighton and Omaha about almost 15 years ago, I was really struck, actually, by how little discussion of race and racism there was here. The focus at that point in a lot of the public conversations seemed to be primarily on socioeconomics rather than on race per se. And I was like, so why are people not really talking about race here? And over the years, I learned about kind of Nebraska nice, which on the one hand can make everyday life fairly pleasant, but on the other hand seems to be a lot about conflict avoidance and not talking about things that are a little uncomfortable. And so from the beginning, as a faculty member at Creighton, I have really tried to contribute to the community's work of naming and facing racism head on. How I go about doing this is mostly talking to people. That's how I met Ajamal. The work on housing and redlining that I'm going to talk about next also came out of, just it's like, I'm going to start talking to people about housing and try to find out why Omaha is so segregated, more than 50 years after the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. So I'm going to share my screen to go on and answer question number 2. All right, so we try this. So this should work. Share slideshow from the beginning. All right, you see the slides? Yeah, okay. So this is the presentation. That's who I am. You got that. So I'm going to just start with redlining. For those of you, when I started this research, actually the redlining map of Omaha was not available. I had to go to the archives in DC to get it. Now you can get the redlining maps from all over the country on the web, and the conversation since Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, has become much more pervasive. But I started this research, it's kind of hard to believe. It was not that long ago. It's like 2015, so 6-7 years ago. This conversation has really shifted and become much more prominent. So you're probably familiar with the lending guideline maps that were created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a New Deal agency back in the mid-1930s. That divided, existing cities. This is every city in the US with a population of more than 40,000 people, into areas that were, whether or not basically the federal government was going to underwrite private investment into those neighborhoods. And they were green, best; blue, still desirable; yellow, definitely declining; and red was hazardous, which is where the word redlining come from. So this is a redlining map of Omaha, which, as I said, you can now get on the web. But I actually went to the archives outside of Washington, D.C., and actually held one of the original maps in my hands. And what you see is kind of, the north-south. Actually, at that point, Omaha kind of stopped west at about 72nd Street. So this map only goes west to about 72nd Street. But you sort of see there's 3 areas that are considered hazardous, sort of redlined on this map. There's, starting from the south, there's an area that was sort of like the stockyards, which was considered to be not desirable because of the stockyards. And then going up, there's a tiny little red part. They're kind of pinkish, actually, which is there was a brewery there, and again, sort of a industrial, not a very attractive place. And then kind of just north of downtown, there is an area that was formerly called the Near North Side, which was where a lot of the African American population that had come to Omaha in the Great Migration was living. And I think it's important to recognize that these neighborhoods, and particularly the Near North Side, had been concentrated with African Americans by local authorities before the federal government came in. So these maps were not like the federal government imposing. These maps were the federal government recognizing with the best real estate men in the city, as the report went, where people were living. And so these red areas were basically like, well, we're not going to underwrite, we're not going to invest in these areas. So I think people really focus on the red lining, but I think it's also, in looking at these maps, really important to focus on what I call the green lighting, which is kind of flipping the frame, which is that the green area is where the government said, oh, here's where we really want to put money. Here's where we really want to invest. And if you think about how Omaha has developed over the last, half century plus, the development to the west, which has been, was overwhelmingly white and is still predominantly white, was where the money went. And that green lighting to sort of, move west came from this map back in the mid 1930s. So this is a map of what's called Omaha's racial dot map today. This comes from census data through a center at the University of Virginia. And you can see the blue dots, each dot sort of represents certain population. The blue dots are white people. The yellow dots are Hispanic, Latino people. The red dots are Asian, people of Asian descent. And the green dots are African Americans. And so you can really see, for those of us who are familiar with kind of the various parts of the city, you can really see the segregation in the city today. And so if you want to look at the maps side by side, there you see that area of, that kind of north-south axis, north of downtown and south of downtown, that was redlined, and yellow is the area that is heavily African American and Hispanic, North and South Omaha today. So that's kind of the template for the city from the 1930s. So that's like what, almost 90 years ago now. And these are maps, this series of maps I'm going to show you are what the city looks like today in terms of sort of the geography, or kind of the human geography of the city. So, and I pull these maps from a variety of different places, so they all look a little different, but it's kind of stark how much the pattern is similar. So this is the income. So you see that the darker blue, which heads west, is higher income, and the paler areas are lower income. So again, we see lower income in that kind of north-south axis, and then as you move west, income rises. This is a map from the Washington Post that shows what they call super zips, which are zip codes that have high income and college attainment. And again, you see that the areas to the east, which are the dark blue areas, are 20% lower, and then as you move west, move into those sort of higher level zip codes in terms of percentiles on a nationwide basis. This is a map of employment centers and high unemployment, and what we see is that not just residential development, but commercial development also moved west in Omaha, whereas the high areas of unemployment are again in the northeast part of the city, and specifically, in the eastern part, and specifically very heavily concentrated in the northeast part of the city. Here's child poverty. This is where kids who live in poverty. This is 2000, so it's a little old. But you see again that sort of concentration of child poverty in the north-south corridor, north and south of downtown. This is from the Census Bureau. This is what are called neighborhoods of opportunity, which are a variety of factors. The blue areas, again, moving towards the west, are greater chance of success for kids who are born in who are born there, growing up there. Those areas that are red are areas of lower opportunity. The next map is where affordable housing is in Omaha. So you see that affordable housing, which in Omaha tends to be older, there's not a lot of new affordable housing being built, and most affordable housing is concentrated east of 72nd Street, so that people who don't have high incomes are generally going to be living east of 72nd Street, and actually even more concentrated, the farther east that you go. And similar to that, you see housing code violations. So housing code violations are very, again, concentrated east of 72nd Street, in large part because that's where a lot of the older housing stock is. Property evictions. This map was done by my colleague Pierce Greenberg, who is a sociologist here at Creighton, and he and Gary Fisher did some work to really identify where evictions are, which are incredibly disruptive to families and particularly to kids in school. And again, we see that concentration in the east and particularly in the northeast. And these are school performance ratings of the schools, high school and middle schools in Douglas County. Again, we see sort of needs improvement in the east, moving towards sort of good and great, and then excellent the farther west you go. This is actually a sort of a chart that shows why, to some degree, that is the case, which is that the farther east you are, the higher the percentage of free and reduced kids who are eligible for free and reduced lunch. So that in the Omaha public schools, 74% of the kids are eligible for free and reduced lunch, whereas when you move to West Side, which I think of as the first generation white flight school district in Omaha, it's 32% free and reduced lunch kids. In Millard, which is like the second generation white flight school district, it's 22%. And those are kind of complementary or reversed in terms of the percentage of kids of color, which is high in, you say the percentage white is low in the Omaha public schools and then gets higher as you move west. Health is another. This is life expectancy, where there's an area that has lower life expectancy, again, sort of in that north-south eastern Omaha corridor, and then life expectancy improves. And the difference between different areas, different zip codes of Douglas County is 12 years life expectancy difference. And then, just in terms of sort of the political, this has a political aspect to it. This is the 2020 census self-response rate as of May 2020. And you see that, again, that area, that corridor, that north-south corridor in eastern Omaha has a lower self-response rate, just sort of not as, not likely to be undercounted in the census. And then this is my last slide, but I find this slide actually incredibly revealing, because I think a lot of people in Omaha think of North Omaha as sort of African American and South Omaha as Hispanic, but what this shows is that this is the average percentage of the census tract that a person who is, say, Hispanic lives in is actually only 26.6% Hispanic. And the average Black person who lives in Omaha, that average census tract is actually only about a third Black or African American. But the average census tract that a white person lives in Omaha is almost 84% white. And what this says to me is that the racial isolation of white people in Omaha is really quite extreme, whereas the racial isolation of Black people and Hispanic people in Omaha is much, much, much less significant. So that when we're talking about segregation, we're actually talking about Black people and Hispanic people being more in mixed neighborhoods and white people being really much more in racially homogeneous neighborhoods. All right, that's a lot of maps to throw at you. I'm going to stop sharing and move on to question 3, which was, what does it mean to say that racism is a system, and why are data essential for describing and understanding that system? So systemic racism is a term that I think really, I mean, I've been thinking about it, talking about it, writing about it for quite some time, but I think it really only rose to the level of sort of a public term that people were really talking about in the kind of spring and summer of 2020 with both the COVID, the beginning part, the first wave of the COVID pandemic, where we saw how communities of color across the country were so heavily affected in terms of illness and mortality by that first wave of COVID. And, you know, because so many people were essential workers, because people had underlying health conditions, because people didn't have as much access to healthcare, because people needed to use public transportation. I mean, there were all different kinds of reasons. But there was this sense that you know, people of color are being really much more heavily affected at not at an individual level, but at this like broad scale level. And that's when these sort of systemic conversations started. And then the murder of George Floyd, along with other tragic deaths, you know, Ahmaud Arbery and some other things, really helped to reveal, again, a pattern of harm at the hands of law enforcement, not just sort of individuals being killed or injured, but this sort of this persistent pattern. And so I think, you know, that there's this conversation has really risen. And so I want to just make two points about that. One is, so this is one. The first is that systemic racism isn't just sort of a catch-all term that says that racism is kind of big, sprawling, ubiquitous, messy, you know, hard to describe. It actually, saying that racism is a system actually taps into a lot of what we know about systems and especially social systems. There's like a whole field of study on systems and social systems. And we know that systems kind of keep rolling along. They perform the function that they were designed to function, even when the people in them change. So as long as the kind of essential story or mental model of the system continues. And so people like Brian Stevenson have said, you know, look, we have racism in, you know, in slavery, and then we have racism in Jim Crow and lynching, and then we have, you know, racism today. Like, we still have systemic racism. It just kind of looks a little different and it plays out a little differently, but we still have huge disparities in terms of wealth and you know, housing and education. So for racism, you know, with racism, for example, we know that Black kids don't do as well in school as white kids in general. And, you know, what Black kids are in fewer gifted and talented classes, they're in fewer AP classes, they're in fewer IB classes, they're referred to special education more often, they're suspended and expelled more frequently. And that is, you know, a racist system that sort of justifies and explains this, and actually has a really hard time transforming itself, even though there are a lot of people in the system who would really like to have a different result. Because really the system is designed to do exactly what it's doing. And this operates at multiple levels. So like at the macro level, you know, we have structures like school district lines that were designed for segregation and differential investment in schools. And they're still operating the way that they were designed to do. They still operate that way. And, you know, right before I came to Omaha, there was a big, you know, discussion about the one Omaha, one school district. And we saw that sort of political pushback that happens when you challenge these structures at a macro level. And then at the micro level, you know, at the individual level, There's a lot of research that expectations of white kids versus expectations for kids of color really have an effect on how kids do, and that these are expectations that many people hold, some often implicitly or subconsciously, and that's it's sort of a self-perpetuating cycle of differential expectations. And because not only like teachers have these expectations, but the public does, so sort of people just kind of accept this rather than being really outraged by it. And so I think that, you know, from my perspective, it's useful to think of racism really as a system, not just like systemic racism, but like as a system and operating as a system. And we're part of that system. All of us are part of that system. We are the system. So that's point one. And point two is that to really see a system, you really need to see the macro as well as the micro. And so you have to see not just what happens, like with, you know, continuing my example of kids in education, you can't just look at individual kids. You really have to look at kids across the board. Like, you know, how are kids overall doing? And that's where the data come in. And, you know, people think of data as really dull and dry and technical and overall not very interesting or sexy. But if we're really trying to understand the system and tell a story about what the system is doing, then data are absolutely essential. And we need to both, you know, ask questions to collect data and then share and really work with the data so that we really understand how the system is working at this kind of system global level. And the data tell us that schools in East Omaha are attended by schools who qualify for free and reduced lunch and who are more kids of color. And the data tell us that for the further west you go in Douglas County, the fewer kids there are that qualify for free and reduced lunch, and the fewer kids of color there are. And so those data and sort of how those kids are doing in terms of academic achievement really kind of reveal the story of the system of K-12 education in Douglas County, and how it operates along lines of race and socioeconomics. And, you know, as evidenced by the maps, if you delve into the data, you see the same kind of patterns. You know, if you're looking at housing or health, income and wealth, employment, you know, just pretty much across the board. And altogether, those data really tell a story about geographical racism. You know, investment and disinvestment over time and space in different groups of people and in different parts of Omaha, the city, and Douglas County. And I just have to say, you know, Omaha is not unique in this. I mean, you look at a lot of cities across the country. Many cities, you know, every city with a population over 40,000 in 1930 was redlined. So these patterns of investment and disinvestment and segregation are very, very prevalent across the country to varying degrees. So Omaha is typical, which doesn't make it, you know, any better. But I think it's important to understand that Omaha is not unique in this. So I guess the bottom line there is that if you care about systems and you really, you know, want to change systems, you really have to think about data, and you really have to, you know, use data, look at data, be honest about the data. And there's so much good data out there. So that's what I have to offer in response to these three questions. I'm going to stop at this point and hand it back to Ajmal, who's going to, I guess, MC the next part of the question and answer, or maybe he has questions himself.
Well, you know what, showing a sense of chair of the board of more and humility and so on, I'm going to let the audience do what they need to do. So this is their section, and as a moderator, folks, I think we're going to do something a little different. If we have some stuff you'd like to put in the chat, let's do that. And also let's show some love that if you want to call an audible, as we say, and just ask the Palma the direct question, take your mic off and say it. But remember, we only have like about 25 minutes or less. And we also have an evaluation we'd like you to complete too. So let's be very brief as we can. And she's also available afterwards through her contacts, through her email and so on. So you can track her down through her publications and email. So again, this is not the end all. So anyone wants to open it up and start it, go from there. And I just want us to be brief because again, we don't have a lot of time. You can go via the chat. We have a facilitator to come through our Facebook. So we'll have more opportunities to raise questions more than anything. So go forward, anyone.
Well, I see Beth has her hand up, so
there you go.
Go, Beth.
Go.
I have that. Thanks.
You're mute again.
Yeah, you're either mute or frozen. Yeah.
There you go. Open. Good. You're good. We can hear you now. You're open. You're mute again. You're going back and forth. Okay, you're open now. Okay, can you okay,
on the news this evening? On the news this evening, the Nebraska unicameral, I think, unanimously passed a bill that gives more money for North and South Omaha. Do you have hopes that that bill will have some improvements relative to anti-racism? And then my second question is, there were 3 proposals to the city council yesterday afternoon about the Mutual of Omaha Tower downtown, the urban core development, and the streetcar. Do you think any of that, I'm going to just broadly say downtown development, can have anything to do with decreasing anti-racism? Thank you.
So I'm hesitant to sort of talk about specific proposals, specific policies. I do think, so a couple just general reactions. I think at the local level, I think it would be helpful if like the city planning department started explicitly considering racial impacts of developments, of planned developments, and effects on, say, affordable housing in decisions that the city makes. And I have not yet seen that, but I think that there are places that are I think more upfront about really what is actually happening in terms of the effects of development, redevelopment, in terms of things like gentrification and displacement, and also who's making money, where is the wealth flowing, as they used to say in Watergate, follow the money. So I think that just like a much more open conversation about like the range of effects of these development. I mean, I have seen similar to when I came to Omaha, similar to my sort of like, there's not really much conversation about race here. I was also like, there's not much conversation about affordable housing here. And again, I think that these kinds of effects of development decisions that do affect housing and people and sort of the distribution of wealth, I think it would be helpful if there was more clarity and sort of more upfront discussion of that. I think in terms of the unicameral, I think it's great that I think it's great to invest in parts of the city and the state that were traditionally underinvested. What I would hope is that the benefit from that goes to people who have lived there for a long time rather than investors or people. I mean, that's one of the issues with gentrification. So that's all I'm going to say about that, because I know Ajmal wants me to be brief.
She reads nonverbal very well. We have 4 different on Facebook, whether it's coming in. Mary from Facebook asked, systemic racism is relatively new to the public term. How long is it like to make it for it to be more widely accepted? She has some other points about deniers out there, but the question is, how well do you think we can understand what you're talking about or what we're talking about when we say systemic racism, considering what's been bannered in our local media and so on?
I think that's a really important question. And it's funny, I think it actually goes to the data question, because I think that part of the, like, again, going back to sort of the academic work on systems, I think people really started to understand a lot about systems when we actually got the sort of the capacity to do like big data. So, with actually the computing power that really ratcheted up like in the late 80s and 90s. And so now, you can look at an amazing amount of data that, comes from, a lot of it comes from the census, but it's collected by lots of other sources as well, state departments of education, of housing, of, criminal justice, of all these kinds of things. And all of that data, which you can sort of look at and analyze in all kinds of different ways, like over and over and over again, it tells the same story. And it really has been, I think, incredibly important to reveal these systemic dynamics that are happening. And I don't think, big data is not going anywhere. And and in fact, it's getting more and more sophisticated. More and more universities have like a website, like the racial dot maps, a website where you can go and look at census data and really see the patterns very graphically and very clearly. And when you can kind of see the system patterns that clearly, it's kind of hard to, even though it's a new concept, it's kind of hard to sort of say it doesn't exist.
So Liz has her hand up, so we didn't actually talk, but we also have like 4 other comments in the chat too. So Liz, do you want to say something now?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Strand, for this whole presentation. It's been great. My name is Lizzie. I'm a documentary film director about. Hi, yeah. So yeah, I'm the director for a documentary series about redlining in Omaha that intersects perfectly with this whole presentation. A lot of what we do in the series that's still ongoing is focusing in on what you were describing kind of in the second question about what is redlining, and then a lot of the data you went into in the third question. But some of the episodes we focus on go beyond some of the sides that you incorporated, like education, housing, economics. And I would love to hear like your thoughts on the intersection of redlining and any one of the following topics, which we cover in the series, and that is voting, criminal justice system, the highway transportation system, and overall health, being it like mental, physical, environmental. So those are a bunch of different areas, but if you have one that jumps out to you that you're willing to talk about the intersection of redlining in that topic, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think that if you look at areas of, I mean, the HUD, has this term for sort of areas of concentrated poverty and areas of concentrated, they call them, I can't think of, recaps, or areas of racial concentration and concentrated areas of poverty. And when you look at those areas, like all the things in the maps that I mentioned, and the additional aspects that you're talking about, sort of, lower voting turnout, lower voting registration, higher levels of formerly incarcerated or people with felony convictions. A few states have enfranchised people who have been convicted of felonies and then and served their time, but most states have not. So there's this, like, all of those things I think are concentrated in areas of concentrated poverty, and because of redlining historically, those areas of concentrated poverty were, at least in urban areas, tended to be either integrated or African American. So I mean I see those areas that you talked about, Lizzie, as just sort of the same pattern. It spreads across all of these issues. I don't know if that answers your question.
We have another question coming in. Palma, there's someone from the Notre Dame Housing Group raised a point. What are school districts doing to address some of these disparities, I guess, related to redlining? The other point I just want to add there is there's a underfoot to have Burke High School renamed to another name because Burke was one of those segregationists who, again, would not hire African-American teachers back in the 40s and 50s. And I know a number of teachers who actually had to go to Council Bluffs and elsewhere, even though they were educated in Nebraska. So it's like those southern redneck states where they're getting rid of those Confederate flags and statues in there. So the question is, from your vantage point, what are school districts to address some of the very things that you talk about in terms of your presentation?
Yeah, I mean, I think different school districts are different school districts are different. I mean, I think the how should I put this? I think that there is greater awareness. I have been doing work with public educators in Nebraska, and I think that there is a nucleus of teachers, white and teachers of color, who are extraordinarily concerned about these issues of disparate achievement and disparate resources and different expectations for kids, and are really trying to both integrate sort of different approaches to teaching into their own classrooms, to talk to their colleagues, and to the extent possible, make a difference in their districts. There is really I think public schools in Nebraska in general, but across the country, are really under attack right now. The whole critical race theory, you think of that as a backlash against the rising awareness of systemic racism that happened in 2020, and then in 2021 we have critical race theory. This is a way to sort of shut down conversations about race and racism, particularly in public schools. And that's certainly on the agenda here in Nebraska. And so I think that I think the school districts are walking this line between a group of teachers and a group of I think probably some parents as well, who really do want to have these conversations, who do support things like multicultural education. A very, very vocal and well-organized and well-funded group of people who are agitating to shut down these conversations. The state, which is, got its hand in things. And I think people are very, very nervous because of, publicized school board meetings where people are going crazy. And I do think this is actually a topic that came up at a recent Omaha Community Council meeting, that to have these kinds of conversations in the community more broadly, so that not just parents, but, and particularly white parents, but the broader community can develop a kind of a consensus of support to have these conversations and to really be honest about what's happening in the schools. Because without that sort of community, I think the broader Omaha community, this is my sense, is sort of just kind of afraid of these conversations. And so what happens in the schools, whoever is the most vocal sort of is kind of calling the shots.
We have like 7 questions coming. I'm not sure what to do in terms of, we're going to run out of time here. But
I can't talk that fast.
yeah, there's a lot of questions, and I don't know if we can get to all of them, but some of them have been in line longer than others. But one that just jumped out, and I guess it comes from Julie, and I got to highlight this a little bit. I think Julie must have telepathy, because some of the very things I would ask, and I'm going to read exactly what she said. Matter of fact, I'm going to put sunglasses on because I got retina damage from reading it. But she says, is there a difference when it comes to community investment, or who is doing the investing, and what kinds of concerns might there be? There's a number of questions. When there are tax dollars, for example, that are up for grabs when it comes to investing in traditionally redlining community, will some of this funding go back to the line pockets of white people rather than to benefit the community? And that's been a big issues of contention locally, with all this money may be coming down. So can you speak briefly to that, and then we can move on to the next question, because we have about 10 minutes left.
Yeah, I think this is, this is an issue in a lot of different cities, that neighborhoods like North Omaha that were redlined, that were underinvested, that people who lived in those communities did not build the kind of wealth that people who lived in the green light communities built. those neighborhoods are actually very well situated. They're often close to downtown. They're kind of prime real estate. And so there is this sense of, well, it would be great to redevelop or to develop, you know, to invest in these parts, in these areas. Unfortunately, what tends to happen is that investment doesn't go to the people who have lived there for generations. And that's an issue that is an issue.
Michelle from Zoom asks, how can more people who have not experienced this discrimination or want to be more involved move beyond talking to internet? Do you have where we can start, or how can we do some things locally? Is there something, I guess some of that may fall back to more, but do you have some specifics of how people get more involved in this kind of work?
I mean, I think that there are these public conversations in a way that there were not 15 years ago. I mean, I think, you know, Inclusive Communities facilitates conversations. More is holding, you know, these kinds of conversations. The Omaha Community Council for Racial Justice and Reconciliation. But I guess I would really, I think that pretty much everybody, wherever we are, we have a sphere of influence. You know, I'm a faculty member, so I teach a lot of classes, and funny thing, racism is almost always relevant to pretty much any topic that I don't talk exclusively about racism, but I integrate conversations about that into the subjects that I teach. I think that most of us do have places, you know, maybe we're in an HR department, and that's a place where we can ask questions or raise issues or just engage in conversations that other people, you know, that haven't been going on. So I think that, you know, there are community related things that we can do. The ADL does amazing work. The Anti-Defamation League does amazing work in schools. And what we can like write our city council and say, you know, it would be great if the planning department, you know, had a plan for affordable housing and had a plan for addressing the racial effects of, you know, I think that people can have a lot of influence at the local and closer to home level. Just start talking to people.
Notre Dame had their hand raised up. Notre Dame, did you want to respond? I know you've been there for a while, but we had a sequence of people. Notre Dame, housing? Open your mic, whatever.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Oh, I hear you well.
Okay. I sent my message in a chat. I'm grateful. As I put up my hand, I just kept listening, and Palma, Joy, you responded to my thoughts about the question about what's going on in the schools. You know, how the parents and the political system and the conversations, but it's like, how do we really help our students enter the world they're living in? I also want to thank you for that, plus your introduction of yourself, because I didn't realize that history of yours. You walked right where we're walking now, but it's Omaha. And the fact that you came to Omaha and you kind of came head on with this, don't talk about it. So I thank you for having stayed with the topic and sharing your story and your life. Some of my substituting has been on the east side of 72nd. So schools like in South Omaha, the Q's, All Saints, Sacred Heart, those kind of places, St. Peter and Paul. And the children are just lovely, and they're open, and some of the literature things that they read are helping them understand some of these issues. So I'm hoping someone doesn't call it CRT and start shutting them down.
No.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're down to about the last 5 minutes. We want to get people to do the interview. Before I do that, I want to give Palma just a chance to close the comment, but I do want to make a shameless plug. Moore is going to have, I think on the 7th of April, one of our board members is going to do a presentation on education, Ebony McKaiser, who's really good in being an education consultant. So we're going to have some people talk about some of the challenges we face in education. I know we have some other events that Karen is going to host with the Malcolm X Foundation new executive director, and then of course with Dr. Donna Pope. It's coming up in April, so check our web page out. And again, the same kind of conversations where they talk and get a chance to engage in the audience. my last point I just want to say is we do have that evaluation we'd like you to fill out. We also look for more volunteers, participants. We're trying to expand our scope to get more people not only in Omaha, but elsewhere. We may even have national people coming in through Facebook, having these conversations, because again, this is hopefully an opportunity for us to engage each other in an honest way. I want to just point out, Palma has an article that I read years back. It was written in 2017, Mirror, Mirror on the Wall, Reflections on Fairness and Housing in the Omaha Council Bluffs region. And it's at the Creighton School of Law publication. It's online. And I know she has some other publications done, but again, deconstructing the concept of racism, the research, what's happened locally, and how can we be better as a community to talk about these important issues in many circles. So I just want to say that. And then, Palma, do you have any last closing comments before we move to the evaluation part of our meeting tonight?
Sure. So I'm just going to issue a little bit of a challenge, and I'm going to challenge everybody here to, like, find somebody tomorrow or over the next week and say, I was in this Zoom last night and they were talking about, housing and racism and systemic racism, and start a conversation with somebody who you think you've never really had a conversation like that with before, but think that they might be interested or receptive. And because that's the way these conversations and become normalized, and step over the line of Nebraska nice a little bit is what I would say. My experience is that it has, we accomplish more when we're connected, and conversations are the way that we find other people who are on the same wavelength.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you today and the audience participation. This is one of those kind of opportunities that we get to talk among ourselves and between ourselves about these important issues of the day. And one of the things that I'm constantly reminded, I keep saying, it's the silence of our friends. So with all the information that's out there, we should not be sitting on the sidelines on our hands when we know that we have to speak oftentimes for those who cannot speak for themselves. The evaluation link is in the chat. We also will start to probably send the evaluation out to participants, because we really want to get more input from people who are around this Zoom and Facebook Live to tell us what they see as important issues related to race equity and anti-racism. So I just want to thank all of you for participating. We're going to stay on just a little bit longer, get people to look at if they want to do the evaluations. And also, what I was remiss in not sharing, this is funded partly through the Humanities Nebraska. They've given us a small grant to bring speakers in and presenters, and particularly people who have lived experience as well as experience with this topic, to help educate and also facilitate other opportunities to do more in this community. I will say this emphatically, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but in all of the money that we pump into some of these so-called DEI programs, they oftentimes don't bring the community in. And I find it painful in the positions I've been in, where you would have me as the only African-American male in a room of 36 people talking about criminal justice, juvenile justice. How does that work? Or if I'm in a state committee and the only African-American male in there, or even person of color, what kind of pressure do I have to be constantly the lone wolf or the lone fox, and use those metaphors to deal with some of those issues? We can only convert people up to a certain point, but it is not about us as the one, it's about us as the many. So I thank you very much for participating. We are exactly right about 7 o'clock. And so we're going to just kind of hang out here a little bit, give you a chance to look at that. And the evaluations, like I say, you can get those from us later also, if you're not going to be a quick writer and all that. But more than anything, we just want to hear your feedback. And we have a number of things on our webpage we'd like for you to look at. Shameless plug again. I like using that term a little bit. I don't know why, but I think more is in a position to do more by our t-shirts. We have wonderful t-shirts there. And also we have a place where we're going to have Ask Aljamal a question, and hopefully Aljamal might develop into a response direct to you, or maybe do something like this, a little podcast. But our agenda primarily is to make people comfortable to talk about reconciliation, so on. So let me stop there. And any other thing, as we always say, may the force be with you, and Baroko. And for those of you who don't know, Baroko means like good night in Setswana. I like saying that because we used to say that all the time when I was in the Peace Corps. So I keep reminding myself that I am, as they are, one and the same. So thank you.
Thank you.
And may the force be with you. So I will stop the recording at this point.